by sheer accident, I had an opportunity to study philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and I fell in love with it. And I fell in love with it for a very, very concrete reason. The problem that had haunted me was something that came out of my reading of Freud. Namely, when I was reading Freud, he had this idea that the self, the subject, was in the head, right? And had these, ego and the superego and the id bubbling up. And I just thought, that's nonsense. That I know that my subjectivity has something to do with the way people respond to me. Something to do with how I was painfully aware from my earliest days as a kid of the possibilities of humiliation. And once you know you can be humiliated, then you know that yourself is not up to you. And the day I read Hegel's account of the master and slave, there it was, a model of the subject that was not in the head, but somewhere between you and me, out there in the world. And that for me was a revelation. No one else talked like that. No one else thought like that. And I just thought, if we're going to change the world, we've got to change hearts and minds. We've got to change the way we think about the world. And Hegel looked for me like, yep, that's the way I want to begin thinking about the world. Begin thinking about how human beings are bound together in these relationships of radical dependency. So that was the word that I felt was missing, I still think is missing, from our shared vocabulary. That we are radically dependent beings. And when I say we're radically dependent, I don't mean we're just dependent on others for food or for help. I mean who I am in my soul, in myself, is how I connect, get responded to, get recognized, fail to get recognized by others. Others can humiliate, harm, devalue, degrade. And I think that's where human life is lived, in those relationships of intersubjectivity. So yeah, my first philosophical insight was the subject is not in the head. It's in the social world itself. We are taught independence, and we need to be, right? We need to separate from mom. We need to separate from school. And at a certain point, adolescence, we learn to separate from the peer group. And the idea in our society, which is our individualism is, and it's not a bad thing, that people should make their own lives. They shouldn't have to live lives that are scripted for them by previous history. So there's an intimate relationship between our ideas of choosing a life and individualism, which means we tend to block out the place of dependency in life, right? And see it as something that only happens when you're very small or very old or very ill or incapacitated. I mean, it's always a sign of failure. Rather than, as I'm suggesting, to see love as a structure of dependencies, to see being member of an orchestra as a structure of dependency. So these more, right, affirmative, celebratory ways in which it's obvious we are dependent, but we don't hide those occasions. We celebrate them, but they usually are not depicted as forms of dependency. So we've got to bring the notion of dependency back into our vocabulary. What does it mean to learn or acknowledge dependency? And here I want to say this is a cultural issue. it can't just be learned. It has to be part of a deeper fabric of self-understanding, right? It has to be part of thinking of yourself as always dependent, right? So there are certain fantasies of independence. Um, the gated community. The gated community is a fantasy that I don't have to trust anyone else if I have the right things in place, right? I can be protected. I can have the chauffeur bring the kid to school, and the delivery man brings the things to me through the guard. And I'm not really dependent. Well, of course, it's a system of massive dependencies, just chosen dependencies, but still it's just dependencies. So so I think, and this is what I mean by philosophy having a place in culture. This is how having pictures and images of human life and of human lives, pictures and images of our relationship to institutions, understanding of ourselves in particular ways, I think all of that would have to change for the notion of dependency not to be learned um, the way people learn it in therapy. That's a series of private lessons, but as a cultural learning. Um, I think that's what a radically modern philosophy would do.